Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jeff, and this is Not Just Book Reviews. And today on the channel, I'm going to be talking about a Clark Ashton Smith short story called The Vaults of Yoh-Vombis. So I'll talk a briefly bit about weird fiction. I am new to weird fiction. I grew up really reading science fiction and fantasy of a more modern vintage, and through most of my adult life, I then moved to popular fiction and literary fiction and horror fiction, and I never went back and read any really of the weird stories. I've tried Lovecraft every once in a while, every 3 or 4 years. I think I would try Lovecraft, and I could not get into his impenetrable sentences. They were really difficult, so I never really got into Lovecraft. And then I read China Miéville, who Perdido Street Station and The Scar, particularly the first two Bas Lag books, which I thought were phenomenal. And there was something about his prose. It was like he was channeling Lovecraft in a way that was, I thought, better. Like his sentences had more life and more verbs, frankly, than Lovecraft's did. There was something more modern about it. But something in my brain was like, oh, this is weird fiction stuff. And then I learned a little bit more about the history of fantasy, which at that point I was very ignorant on, and I thought just kind of began with Tolkien, and discovered this entire, beginning of the 20th century, weird fiction and Lord Dunsany and all these amazing writers. So recently, of the past 2 months, I picked up some Lovecraft collections, and I got online collections of Algernon Blackwood, Clark Ashton Smith, William Hope Hodgson, and then I found this big book, one of these online big book of horror short stories, but they're all from that period. So I think Chambers is in there, and there's all kinds of wonderful stuff. It's all of the classics of that genre back in the 30s, 20s. So I'm loving it. I'm working my way through Lovecraft right now, but nothing's really popped yet. I mean, I read Call of Cthulhu, the story, and I really liked it. That's one that definitely popped for me. And I read At the Mountains of Madness years ago, which I liked. But the first one that really popped out at me, where I thought, oh, this is amazing, was this Clark Ashton Smith story, The Vaults of Yoh-Vombis, which I can't even remember now why I came to pick that one as my first one. But it's an amazing story, so I'm really excited to talk about it. So it takes place on a future Mars. First of all, it was published in May 1932. And one other thing I want to say, which is coming, is that there are direct lines from this story to Ridley Scott's film Prometheus, which is an Alien prequel. And there are definitely presages to the Alien film franchise, which I want to talk about when we get to certain parts of the story. But I was blown away by a very specific set of scenes and situations that really very much were done in Prometheus. So I will get to it when we get there. So again, it takes place in a future Martian colony. There's this great, as they do seem to do in the Weird Tales, right? They do these frame narratives, so you immediately open to someone saying, this person, there was an expedition that went awry, and one person, Rodney Severn, was the only one who survived. He came back to this base camp and dictated the story of what happened to him to this, our beginning frame narrative, which is classic, seems to be a weird fiction trope, is the Russian egg type things that happen. Then we get a bit about Rodney Severn. Has injuries to his head, which are unexplained. He seems to be in kind of some half trance. They don't know really what's wrong with him. And I think even at the end of this, the frame narrator says he escaped somehow. He took off, and they didn't know where he went. So this is a great tease to what's going to happen. So then the story breaks, and we see the title, The Journal of Rodney Severn, and now we're off and running. So basically, we're with an expedition called the Octave Expedition, and they're heading towards this city called Yoh-Vombis, which is, there was an old Martian civilization. I guess the Yuris is the alien group that were wiped out 40,000 years ago. So seemingly from the present of the story, that human beings are coexisting on Mars with another alien species, and two of the guides from that species are their guides for this expedition. So it's kind of like, there are aliens, humans are there, it's no big deal. It's kind of, in a way, where the story is situated. But there is this 40,000-year-old city that inexplicably was depopulated at some point, and no one really knows why. So The guides are also very wary. None of the indigenous population will go near it, right? So our expedition is off to find out possibly what happened through the archaeological record. Clark Ashton Smith's Mars is cold and desert-like, but breathable air. It's not explained how it's breathable. You know, I think terraforming, I don't know if the terraforming was something that was even conceptualized in the 1930s. I haven't read a lot of the pulp sci-fi, so maybe it was, but we don't hear why. But in a sense, Mars is kind of like, you know, the Himalayas, as it were. It's just kind of like a remote place. So they get to the city and they camp out the night just outside the city. And there's some great text, the 3 selections I want to read about their impressions, which is right in line with weird fiction, what weird fiction does best. So here's the first one. Quote, "Our coming to Yoh-Vombis was sudden and spectacular. Climbing the low slope of a league-long elevation of bare and deeply eroded stone, we saw before us the shattered walls of our destination, whose highest tower was notching the small remote sun that glared in stifled crimson through the floating haze of fine sand." I really like that image of notching the sun, meaning you're looking at the sun and the tower is kind of occluding it somewhat. It was really great. So here's a second piece that I liked. Quote, "Enormous, gaunt, without gradations of shadow or luminosity, the ruins beetled before us in the thin light, like the mausolea of primordial giants that abide from the darkness-eaten aeons to confront the last dawn of an expiring orb." That is Weird Fiction 101. I thought that was terrific. And one more piece. Quote, "I found myself a mood in which I felt the unhuman alienage of our surroundings and the black, fathomless antiquity of the ruins like an almost unbearable oppression. The feeling seemed to be made of a million spectral adumbrations that oozed unseen but palpable from the great unearthly architecture that weighed upon me like tomb-born incubi, but were void of form and meaning such as could be comprehended by human thought. I appeared to move, not in the open air, but in the smothering gloom of sealed sepulchral vaults, to choke with a death-fraught atmosphere with the miasmata of aeon-old corruption." End quote. Woof! That's awesome. So great example of kind of very Lovecraftian weird fiction text. So they really are getting a sense of this city, which is really wonderfully spooky. And while they're sleeping, our narrator wakes briefly and he seems to think that a shadow has detached itself from the ruins and is moving towards the camp, but he gets up and the shadow seems to retreat. And he was in such a funky mood that he's not sure whether he believed it or not. So they head into the city. The guides are completely freaked out. They run away. They're gone. And they pass by into this abandoned city. They're walking around. There are wonderful urns that they find, these burial urns, and they look inside and there are ashes. So we're getting a sense of some kind of sacrifice or burning that has happened, which is really interesting. And then they go downstairs into the vaults beneath the city, and they walk through some catacombs and some hallways, and they come to a blank wall. And now this is where the story proper really kicks off, because on the wall, chained up on the wall, is a dead, desiccated corpse of one of the Yoris, which is the original race that inhabited the city. And it's got some kind of thing on its head. They weren't quite sure. It looked like some kind of cloth hat of some kind on its head. And I think Octave goes over to touch the corpse, and when he touches it, part of it disintegrates. Some of it doesn't, but part of it does. So it's so old and desiccated. But then all of a sudden, what they thought was a little hat on the corpse suddenly moves and flexes and jumps on and lands on Octave's head. The creepiest, it's alive, it's on his head, and so he screams and freaks out and runs off into the darkness, into these catacombs, which is just incredible. So I'm going to spoil the hell out of this story now. I'm going to try to find a link to this story. I would say go read it. It won't take you very long, because it gets crazy from here, and it's really awesome. And so again, there's a link in the description box, but spoilers ahead. So this wall and this corpse immediately brought me to the movie Prometheus. So the movie Prometheus, for those of you who haven't seen it, again, go see it because I'm going to spoil it to some degree. When they find the aliens on that planet they go to, they find a doorway into a chamber which is closed, and one of the aliens is lying on the ground, and they only see the body from the neck down. It seemed to have been decapitated by the wall that came down. It was a portal. So, but behind that wall, when they open it up, is all of the, what could be considered from this story, the urns, right? That was kind of a visual similarity. In the Prometheus, they're the urns full of black goo, right? And that black goo is really what creates aliens. It's this incredibly virulent substance which, once it gets inside you, it rewrites your DNA and births all kinds of creatures inside you. It's the genesis of what becomes eventually Alien in the first film. But so, having this door and then going behind it and having these horrible things that take over your body, it's this story. I mean, it's this story. So I was amazed by that, and I wondered if the writers of Prometheus had not had a grounding in weird fiction. So that was amazing. When you'll find out what these aliens do, as I'm going to narrate right now, it's even more interesting. So Octave runs off. They all run off and try to find him, and everybody gets lost. And then finally they come back to the wall where the original event happened. They all find their way back there. And Octave, with this thing on his head, is chopping at the wall, is smashing at it. Winds up knocking a hole in it, I think, at some point. And then our narrator runs to Octave and tries to get the thing off his head, right? So there's some wonderful description here of the alien and what our narrator is doing. So here's Rodney Severn describing briefly when they come and find Octave at the wall. Quote, I, for one, felt a violent upsurge of sudden nausea when I had identified the loathsomely bloated thing that clung to Octave's head and drooped into obscene tumescence on his neck. I did not dare to surmise the causation of its bloating. Oh, creepy. So he makes the hole, and more description then. What the thing was, I should prefer not to imagine, if it were possible to imagine. It was formless as a great slug, with neither head nor tail nor apparent organs, an unclean, puffy, leathery thing covered with that fine, mold-like fur of which I have spoken. The knife tore into it as if through rotten parchment, making a long gash, and the horror appeared to collapse like a broken bladder. Out of it there gushed a sickening torrent of human blood, mingled with the dark, filiated masses that may have been half-dissolved hair, and floating gelatinous lumps like molten bone, and shreds of a curdy white substance. Oh man, it's good. Go Clark Ashton Smith, man. That is hardcore. Quote, conquering my revulsion and choking with the dust, I bent over him and tore the flaccid, oozing horror from his head. So they wound up getting it off him, but what's exposed is half of his head is gone, and there's brains and blood. Basically, the thing ate into his brain, and through part of the filaments of what it was, can control him, and brought him back to this wall to knock it down for reasons that are yet unknown, right? Which is amazing. So then they discover the wall, and the wall that mysteriously opens. I can't remember exactly if it opens or they open it. And on the other side of the wall is this shrieking legions of these creatures and similar creatures like them, and they come pouring through this opening. And since you've just seen what it did to Octave, you're freaking out as a reader. I was listening to this via HorrorBabble. By the way, HorrorBabble is a terrific YouTube channel and also a podcast. And I listened to the Vaults of Yoh-Vombis as I was walking to work one day from HorrorBabble's podcast, and I was freaking out as I was walking. The thing scared the hell out of me in broad daylight. In one workday morning, walking on the streets of New York, and I was scared to death. It really freaked me out. So now these things come pouring through and they, everyone runs and flees, and ultimately Severin realizes that everyone else gets caught, and they all now have these things on their heads, and who knows now what's going to happen next. So finally, Severin almost makes it out, and one of them drops down on his head, and this is also a really cool brief bit of description, which I'm going to read because it's really kind of gross and awesome at the same time. Quote, something dropped upon my head from the roof above, blinding me instantly and closing upon me like a tautened net. My brow and scalp at the same time were shot through with a million needle-like pangs, a manifold, ever-growing agony that seemed to pierce the very bone and converge from all sides upon my inmost brain. So you realize what's happening here. Severin winds up getting it off and breaks through, gets out. But he's the only one who survives. But the part of the deal here is getting it off isn't enough, because even if one gets on you briefly, there's some kind of mechanism, that some kind of chemical thing that happens to you where now you develop this addiction and longing to go back to Yoh-Vombis. And so, he obviously, the story ends with him coming back to the Martian base camp. He narrates the story to our frame narrator, and then he can't take it anymore, breaks out, and winds up, the story ends with him. Actually, the story ends at the very end of Rodney's chronicle, with some wonderful ellipses, right? He's like, I must go back to Yoh-Vombis, back across the desert, and down through all the catacombs to the vaster vaults beneath. Something is in my brain that commands me and will direct me. I tell you, I must go. And that's the end of the story. So, amazing story. Amazing story. It was really the first weird story that really kind of blew me away. I was very happy to read it, and I'm really happy to continue on my journey of weird fiction. So that's pretty much it, all I have to say about it. I do want to say briefly that I'm going to put down in the description box a link to Michael K. Vaughan's show about Clark Ashton Smith. So he has, I think he did a Sunday Penguin about Smith. So I'm going to link that as well. Also, I'm going to link below a link to the story. There's a website called theeldrichdark.com, which has extensive articles and links to a lot of these weird stories. So I'm going to link down below. They have a great preface to the story where they talk about him writing it and him editing it with other folks in Lovecraft, and how it got published, and then the text of the story itself. So I even though I've spoiled a lot of it, if you've stayed on, you should read it because it's really amazing. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.